Hey everybody, Alec Medlock here. So we all have this intuition that choice is a really important part of any tabletop role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons. It's the core way in which players can express themselves through the game. They make decisions in the narrative and in the game world. I think the ability to encourage and foster that kind of decision-making and making that experience of making choices feel organic and exciting, I think that's the mark of a really good DM. I think that's a big part of our job. But it's also part of our jobs as DMs to provide a curated experience for our players. And it's really hard to provide that kind of curated, designed experience without having at least one hand on the reins. And so it seems like there's this tension that emerges between these two elements, between these two really important parts of our job, providing players a chance to express themselves in the game through having the freedom to choose, and keeping some amount of control over the game to provide a really well-curated and well-crafted, well-designed gaming experience. So that's going to be the topic of today's video. How do we both foster decision-making and make our players feel like they are making meaningful choices and guide the action? And I think in order to do that, in order to understand how these two seemingly contradictory things fit together, we have to understand the nature of that choice that's being made. I want to start talking about this with a little thought experiment and a little demonstration. And to that end, we're going to go over to my gaming table. Welcome to my gaming table. So let's imagine that this laid out here in front of me is the perfect linear dungeon. You've tuned your encounters just right. There's this really nice progression, this really nice difference in scale that marks a progression in difficulty through the dungeon. From encounter to encounter, from room to room, you've also got really nice differences in kind that keep switching up the style and the pace of game to maintain those really nice interest curves. It's just the hypothetical ideal capital D dungeon. Now, I've played in dungeons like this as a player where the encounters individually were all relatively fun. The theming of the dungeon was interesting. I liked the character I was playing. Theoretically, everything should have felt right, but I will tell you that as a player in this style of dungeon, I was unable to escape the feeling of being railroaded. Because of the layout of these rooms, I had no choice in where to go. I had no choice in what to do. There's always this sort of background, low-level decisions that you have as a player, like what action to take in combat or what target to go after. And of course, there's one main choice in this dungeon of forward or back, but that's not a terribly interesting choice. That's essentially the choice of play the game or not play the game. These aren't the kinds of decisions that I'm interested in trying to get at. So as I've said, the problem with this is you don't give your players real, meaningful decisions in the dungeon. It's really hard to get away from the feeling as a player that you're being led by the nose by the DM into doing exactly what the DM wants you to do. Let's see if with a minor adjustment, we can get around that. Okay, now take a look at our layout. I think most people would agree that just on the table, this layout is inherently more interesting. The choices are immediately visually obvious. It no longer feels like a linear path, and it feels like we walk into a room and we've got this nice big open space and 4 immediate decisions staring us in the face. That is already way more compelling than the previous layout. But what about your nice curated experience as a DM? You had planned everything perfectly. There were these nice difficulty progressions, these nice switch-ups of pacing of play. How do you give your players this choice, but also maintain that curated experience that you wanted? Well, probably all of you see where I'm going with this already, so I'll just kind of get to the point. From your player's perspective, they have no idea what's in these rooms when they're here ready to make their choices. So whatever the first room is that they go into, That's where you put your first encounter, represented here by a D4. Let's say they go in this room first. Well, then they open that door, and that's where that first experience is. And whatever the second encounter you have planned for them is, you simply put that in whatever room they go into second, and the third one third, and the fourth one fourth, and so on. So actually, as a DM, you can get exactly that curated experience that you had intended for them to have, and they can feel like they are making choices. Now, you might think this is cheating. The whole point was to give your players a real, meaningful decision to make, and you haven't done that. You've simply given them the illusion of making a decision, and the choice they make doesn't actually make a difference. To which I might respond, yeah, that's exactly right. Because see, the important part of your players making a decision isn't that they make a meaningful decision. It's that they feel like they've made a meaningful decision. The choice itself isn't what's interesting. It's all of the bits leading up to that choice. It's seeing that you have options, taking in and processing the information and weighing those decisions, and then pulling the trigger on something, committing to something. That's the interesting stuff. I know this might sound a little contentious and a little railroady right now. So to further our discussion, let's head back to the thinking table. Another way of thinking about this is to draw a distinction between the choices your players make and the consequences of those choices. Now, making choices, that is the player's domain, but the consequences of those choices, that's yours. Now, when you're really good at this, it will feel seamless. Your players won't notice where their choice ended and where your consequence began. Everything will feel like it naturally results from what they're doing. It should feel seamless, and that requires a little bit of artistry on your part. Let me pause for a moment, lest anyone who's following carefully thinks I'm a hypocrite or a charlatan. Rarely do I plan out my dungeons this way. In fact, I pretty much only do it when I have very little time to prepare, and I need to be able to prepare out a couple of concrete encounters and know that that's what's going to happen that night. In fact, typically when I prepare out my dungeons, I do so very meticulously. I know exactly what's behind each and every door, and I don't change too much on the fly. And I'll admit that with the way I typically prepare my dungeons, I do feel like I'm giving my players more meaningful and more substantial choices to make, because I know what they're getting is a direct consequence of what they chose. And if they never go behind this door, they're never going to see that content. And that's interesting to take note of, by the way, that sometimes a choice feeling meaningful has to do with whether or not you could have experienced something else. The fact that there is the possibility that my players don't see a piece of content does contribute to the feeling that they are actually making decisions. Negative possibility space is a really interesting topic, and I think it's something I want to reserve for another video later on down the line, but we're going to skirt around it as we continue. But the caveat I'm trying to offer is this idea that there's room for both your players making decisions and for you to essentially force the consequence that you want. This is not free reign to just railroad your players into doing whatever you want them to do while hiding behind a thinly veiled, illusory choice. Your game must be influenced by your players' actions. The intended takeaway here is you don't have to abandon your plans entirely or be afraid to make plans in the first place out of some slavish servitude to your players' ability to make free choices in your game. There is room for both. Now, that little 4-room dungeon I showed is a pretty thin example, and it's really just meant to get this one point across. But I think we can abstract away from it and get a lot more mileage out of that concept. And in fact, we don't even have to abstract too far away. For any adventure in which the sequence of events is important, we can use this idea, this separation of the choices your players make and what results from those choices. For example, let's say you're running a murder mystery, something that I've always desperately wanted to do but never had the chance. And let's say that in this adventure, there are clues that your players are going to uncover, and you've got a very strict idea of the order in which those clues need to appear for the adventure to make sense. The first clue that you want them to get is a dagger that has a special mark on the hilt. and you know that the guy who's holding onto that dagger is a local thief turned informant named Three Toes. So the linear dungeon way, the railroady way to do this would be to say, okay, Three Toes is hanging out in this seedy tavern, and he's going to have these questions, and he's going to want to have this conversation. So what happens at the beginning is you are told by the town guard that you need to go talk to Three Toes, and he's over here, go find him. You're limiting your players' choices. You're telling them that there is a particular place that they have to go, and there's an encounter that they have to have because that's the way you've decided it's going to happen. Instead, provide your characters with a wider perspective. Give them a lay of the land, and let them decide where they're going to go first, where they're going to investigate, who they're going to talk to. And whatever decision they make, come up with an interesting reason that Three Toes shows up there and has the desired conversation. And now here's the key to making all of this actually work. The reason he shows up there has to be more interesting than, hey, I was told I had to come find you so that we could have this conversation. If his reason for being wherever they are is more interesting, is more compelling, is more grounded in the narrative that you're trying to sell, your players will feel like that happened organically, and they will feel validated for having made the right choice. By the way, in a previous video, I advocated spending a lot of time in your preparation for your games, and this right here, this exactly is why. Understanding your world, your NPCs, the strands that connect all these moving parts of your adventure makes it a lot easier for you to come up with adjustments on the fly during your game. And not only will it make it easier for you to create things on the fly, it'll also make the things that you adjust and that you create spontaneously more interesting and more grounded in the story you're trying to tell, as opposed to just borrowing from easy tropes. But this doesn't just apply to adventures in which a specific sequence of events is important. Let's say you have a specific piece of content that you really want your players to see, whether it's an adventuring hook or an NPC that they really need to talk to for something later on down the line, or maybe even the entrance to a dungeon. I'll give you an example from a session I ran several months ago at the very beginning of a campaign. I started off the night, before we even sat down and really started playing, by essentially laying out the tiles of the dungeon on the table. I wanted my players to know that at some point during the night we were going to have a dungeon crawl. So our session began with my party on a caravan with some guards that was being guided through the woods by this young fledgling guide. On the road, they were ambushed by some bandits. And in the fray of the battle, it became clear that this fledgling guide that had gotten them lost was in fact leading them into the ambush. There was some tension among the party about what to do with this fledgling guide. The warlock was of the mind that they ought to just kill him. He'd missed his opportunity to be a good person. The paladin, on the other hand, thought, no, I have to try to redeem him. He's unsure, he's young, I can help this person. And in the fray, seeing that his fate was uncertain, the guide got scared and he took off running into the woods. One of the player characters, a dragonborn cleric, decided he was going to chase him down, and he took off running after him. A round or two of combat later, after this cleric had been chasing this guide through the woods, I described the guide as falling through a pit trap covered by some leaves and hitting the ground about 40 feet below at the bottom of this dungeon, and I placed his miniature on the first tile at the entrance of the dungeon, signaling to my players this was the dungeon they were meant to discover. Now, I hadn't planned for this. Frankly, I didn't know how I was going to get my players into this dungeon in the woods. I didn't even really know where in the woods it was, but I saw an opening. I saw a way to make the thing I wanted to happen feel like a natural consequence of a decision that the player made organically. Now, the players in this instance were all 20 years older than I am and had been playing role-playing games for a very long time, and they of course understood exactly what I had done, but one of the players stopped and said, hang on, can I give the Dungeon Master experience for introducing us into this dungeon in that way? Because that felt really cool. But this is my whole point. I had content that I knew I wanted my players to see, and I could have railroaded them, right? I could have just presented an NPC who said, here on your map is this thing I want you to go do, and they would have said, okay, this is the adventure the Dungeon Master wants us to go on. We'll play along, we'll go crawl through the dungeon. Instead, I made their discovery of the dungeon an organic and natural consequence of a choice that they made. In some sense, I forced them into the thing I wanted them to do, but it felt right. So, in conclusion, for now at least, because I have a feeling I'm going to return to this topic and rehash this conversation in the future, it's really important for your players to feel like they have the freedom to choose within your game. But within those choices, or maybe on the other side of those choices, there is still plenty of room for your curated, planned thing to happen. It requires a bit of finessing, and that requires time and experience and practice. But once you get really good at this, you will find yourself allowing your players to stumble right into the game that you wanted them to play. And that, I think, is a distinguishing mark of a really good DM. As always, I hope some of that was helpful and useful. If there's anything you want to hear me talk about or a discussion you want to have, by all means, let me know in the comments below. And until then, happy games.